Hello, thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Aras Ozgun. I'm chairing the Cinema and Digital Media Department of Izmir University of Economics. Tonight, our guest speaker is Mike Figgis, who does not need much introduction at all. He's an Oscar-nominated British filmmaker, a screenwriter, a composer, an author, and a professor of film studies. He's one of the most prominent independent filmmakers and one of the pioneers of digital filmmaking. His 2000 film Time Code has been a milestone in exploring the potentials of digital video technologies towards experimental narrative forms. He has been teaching at the European Graduate School in Switzerland since 2008 and continuing to make independent feature films and documentaries. He's also the author of the 2007 book, Digital Filmmaking, in which he shares his most valuable knowledge and experience in digital film production and aesthetics, which I believe is one of the themes he's going to be pondering upon tonight. Tonight's talk is going to be moderated by our faculty member, Hazal Bayar. My dear colleague, Andreas Treske, who chairs the Communication Design Department at Bilkent University in Ankara, also joins us tonight as a respondent. We are very honored to have you as our guest tonight, Mr. Figgis. Thanks so much for accepting our invitation. Hazal, the floor is Mr. Figgis and yours.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to repeat it that we are really happy to that you join us here this afternoon. And before we start our talk, I'd like to say that I will be moderating the Q&A, and our audience can ask their questions from the chat box on YouTube, and I will coordinate and direct them to you after your talk. If you're ready, dear Mike, we can start with your thoughts on digital filmmaking, and then maybe afterwards we can lead into the narrative form and the structure of narration and how digital filmmaking kind of changed this structure.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'll begin. I think if I go back to the period of Time Code, which shockingly is 20 years ago now, 21 years ago, and the great expectations that many of us had for, what could happen in film. It was a very, very interesting time. I remember being at a conference at the Directors Guild in Los Angeles with Steven Soderbergh, talking about the future of film, the future of digital. And he was more pessimistic than I. He said in the future, I think, we were talking about how, accessible digital was going to make filmmaking and universally, possible for so many more people. His response was there will be 10 times as many bad films being made in 20 years' time as there are now. I think he was wrong. There's probably 100 times more bad films being made, said, well, if you flip the the glass half full, glass half empty, then also there will be 20 times more good films also being made, and I think that's also true. I mean, the truth is there is now a kind of, the word is plethora, or there is a glut of visual media. We are actually being drowned in visual media in a way that we could not have anticipated at the time, but actually probably we could have if you actually did the maths and sort of went, well, if this and this happens, then, but who could have predicted the iPhone, for example, as being, the new kind of master tool, if you like, of human interaction, and not just the iPhone, or, all kinds of digital phones that are basically cameras now. So there's a lot to talk about in terms of what is possible digitally and technically, quite amazing possibilities. But that has to be offset against a kind of more philosophical, I think, discussion about art and about the nature of creativity in terms of the tools, versus actually the intellectual ability to say something real. And of course, the other thing, I remember, you know, at that time doing a series round about, you know, actually a little bit early, probably late 90s, I did a series of documentaries in Hollywood called Hollywood Conversations, where I interviewed many, many different filmmakers and producers and agents and actors and so on, really talking about the state of Hollywood at that time. Actually an interesting book that was published by Figgis as part of their projection series. And looking back now, very interesting. At the same time, I also did a little documentary at Łódź, at the Camera Image Cinematography Festival. And this was probably maybe 15 years ago, where I interviewed all the top directors of photography who were at that festival. I mean, big shooters. And the contempt with which they talked about video and digital filmmaking, and said, no, you know, remind me of, you know, the famous statement of, you know, what's his name? The guy who said, you know, National Rifle Association, you will never take the rifle from my dead hands. It was almost like they were, you know, Roger Deakins, everybody, all talking about, no, but they would never switch to digital. And literally in a matter of a couple of years, they all switched, you know, Deakins, everybody had gone. And now it's almost like an indulgence to shoot on celluloid, you know. So who could have predicted the volatility of change in that period? The one thing that no one really talked about, I certainly didn't, was just the effect of capitalism. And if you look at Netflix now, we look at algorithmic, you know, assessment of media product, let's call it product now. And you see what a terrible mess of, like, what a terrible mess we've made of all these wonderful possibilities, you know. I mean, capitalism is so powerful that there was an interesting point. Actually, after I did Leaving Las Vegas, I shot that on Super 16. That already created a kind of little shockwave in Los Angeles, because suddenly a bunch of younger filmmakers and students were going, we want to shoot on 16, not 35. It looks great. So all the rental companies were kind of going crazy, saying, you know, we're just set up for 35. We don't want this fucking 16 millimeter shit. You know, it's just an annoyance. It was a kind of foretaste of what was going to happen with, let's say, the first really interesting innovations, the PD-100, PD-150 by Sony, the first really cool little video cameras that I shot Time Code and then Hotel on, and a bunch of short movies as well. And that really was like a panic moment for the industry, because when the industry is based on rental and making sure the equipment is as heavy and as big as possible and requires a truck and a lot of big men to carry the stuff, when you suddenly come up with a little camera and kind of go, that's pretty good, you know, it works fine for me. And then you look at films like Festen and the early Dogma films, and you kind of, no, they were crapping themselves, I'm sure, because you could suddenly see unemployment. You could suddenly see people who had a very comfortable business that was really tied down to do with, you know, the way the unions were working, the way the industry was set up. It's all about making money. As Jerry Bruckheimer said to me quite forcibly, it's called the film business, Mike. You know, it's not art, it's show business. It's about business. And so the idea that small technology was this huge threat to the filmmaking community was a very real thing, and filled me with a great deal of pleasure at the time, because there's nothing like a bit of a revolution to kind of like stir the pot and become very creative. Then very quickly, the industry gathered itself and they switched to digital. And of course, they made it very seductive. So, you know, you now like pretty much, you know, you ask anybody, well, you know, what are you shooting your movie on? It's going to be the Arri Alexa, or it's going to be the Red, or it's, you know, they're big cameras. You see them again, you see photographs of them, you know, they're big. Mm-hmm. In my bathroom here in my studio, I have lots and lots of old copies of American Cinematographer, which I've decided to throw away now. But always what's fascinating about those magazines, it's art magazines, you go through it and you, at the back where all the advertisements for equipment are, you know, you see this amazing from just 10 years ago, digital equipment that's being sold, very expensive. A lot of polished metal, nice knobs, lots of nice switches, and it looks great. Totally obsolete now. And one of the things that I ponder about is like, where does it all go? Is there like a huge mountain somewhere of just redundant digital equipment that's only 4 or 5 years old now? Because what was interesting when I came into the film business was really film cameras hadn't changed in 50 years. I mean, they brought out new models and they, you know, and so on and so forth. But the basic mechanics of a camera were like a sewing machine. They were clockwork. The basic chemistry of film stock, it got, you know, faster or whatever, didn't really alter. And so the labs and the manufacturers were basically just softly upgrading equipment as it went along. Digital comes along and suddenly it's a whole new game. Every week someone's bringing out a new product, which is got a higher K rating. It's a 2K, it's a 3K, it's a 4K. You have this ridiculous situation now where Netflix is demanding everything is shot on 8K, and they call it future-proof or something. Future-proof of what? What are they expecting? Expecting people's iPhones to get bigger? Because that's what they're watching on, you know. And by the way, we can talk about that later. I have no problem, you know. But, you know, the idea that, you know, you go from a film like Feston, which is a masterpiece, I think, shot on the PD-150, and then you look at a lot of crap that's being made on 8K on the Alexa or Blackmagic, whatever, you know, and you go, for what? And then the aesthetics of all that is that, you know, suddenly everything's in focus, everything's bright, there is no shadow anymore. And people are shooting because they say, oh, you know, I've just done a film in Hong Kong. You know, the battle cry is always, you know, I'd go, this looks like shit. And they go, no, but we'll fix it in post. You can make it look like anything you want in post. And I go, I don't want it to look like in post. I want it to look good now. Old school, like I want you to light it the way I want it. And then we'll fix it in post if we need to. But I mean, I want, you know, so, you know, you're now watching stuff when you're shooting that looks awful. So I'm meandering. But the knock-on effects of, you know, that first moment of excitement, you know, have not filled me with a great deal of pleasure in the sense of the way it's going now. In terms of mainstream filmmaking, it raises another question, which I think is in a way more interesting, which is basically what is film now? I mean, you know, particularly after the pandemic where everything had to close down and studios had to close down and films were put on hold and all the rest of it. It's kind of one of those interesting things like having a war when once everybody goes back into business, the questions a lot of people must be asking now is like, do we need to be making the same tired old stuff again? You know, I mean, what doesn't this feel a bit boring? Isn't this a good opportunity to kind of like philosophically clean the place out and have a rethink and then a bit of a redefining of now what is the function of film? Because it's certainly not what it was before. It's certainly not the classic idea of, you know, going to a cinema and all sitting together and watching a sort of studio movie. I don't see that as being something that can sustain for too much longer.
Mm-hmm. Maybe like
I've gone to a single screen and I'm wondering if yeah, we're all still here. Yeah.
Yes.
So
maybe like I can like open a parenthesis in here so that maybe like we can still like talk about digital, but maybe add the value of film and the value of digital, like the shooting on video thing. Because like when you talked about like, yes, digital like become you know, everyone can own a camera and shoot something. It is kind of like easier to shoot something on digital, on video. But then again, for example, in 80s, there were like shot on video horror films, which like when we look at from today's perspective, they're like quite crappy when people think on it. Because like, as you said, it's kind of like every year we have this like new technology coming and the old technology becomes like a crappy technology, the visuals and everything. But with film, it's always the same. Maybe we can talk
And,
about this like hierarchy
yeah, and
about video.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's interesting about that too is the subject of seduction, which is that what the big companies did after the initial video revolution was to seduce filmmakers back with and it is interesting. Maybe it's a male thing as well, predominantly, but I think not just male, but the idea of that part of the filmmaking process is love of the objects, is love of the equipment and love of the whole setup. It's very impressive. All the cables and the cameras and the light, it's just like when you see it all kind of set together, wow, this feels like a film. The truth is, of course, you can just go out and shoot on a phone. And by the way, the later iPhones, I think, are superb. I mean, I've been shooting on one, and as long as you can stabilize those cameras and control them as if it was a good old-fashioned camera, I think the end result is pretty amazing. To the extent that in the film I just shot, I had a film within the film where I had a sort of indie crew shooting an indie film on their iPhones and their iPads, and I was cutting the scene, and I suddenly saw, one of the shots, and I went, wow, that looks really, really beautiful. And I assumed it was from, my main camera. And I went, oh no, it's actually from the iPhone. Oh my God, I actually prefer it. It's like saturated beautifully, and it looks like, I don't know, it looked gorgeous, So I never had the snobbery problem. Well, I did. Of course I did, because I also love cameras. But I think I've always been able to override that. If I see something that actually works, I will fall in love with it, regardless of what it is, And so there's no shortage of stuff you can shoot a movie on now. And also sound has got so good. I mean, for my iPhone, I bought a little Shure microphone, stereo microphone. It's amazing. So I say to my students, I now, with the camera and this little microphone and my Mac, I really don't need anything else. Maybe just a cheap plastic thing to put the camera in to keep it stable, So there's that. But then the other thing that comes up is like everyone's shooting, portrait format, because that's how you hold the phone. And that's really interesting. Wow, what do you mean? And then you probably know about Quibi, who went bust. It didn't work, maybe for whatever reason. But they were basically doing, feature dramas in 10-minute increments, but shot portrait format because they were hoping to get commuters on their way to work, and nobody holds a phone in landscape format, So isn't that interesting that something as simple as how you hold a phone would then dictate maybe a whole future trend? Going back to what I said before, what is cinema? Well, cinema is actually pretty much what people watch on their phones now and seem to get a great deal of enjoyment from. So, and if their ergonomics at that are that they have to be in portrait format, then without a doubt, supply and demand will kick in, and they go, oh, no problem, we'll shoot it portrait format, which then begs the question, why not? I mean, I have a real problem with it, but I, prepared to say, why not? I'm prepared to maybe try and shoot something like that. It would be painful for me, given that my entire aesthetic of my entire life has been based on being able to pack the camera, with a widescreen format, and I do have a problem with the kind of, the narcissism of the portrait format, which is, just the whole selfie idea, is something that I think is not good for us. But, so it's like interesting. We could talk about what is the future of cinema in terms of, Citizen Kane and, The Godfather, or we could talk realistically about, that's got nothing to do with it anymore. I'm sorry, that boat already left the harbor some time ago. And now we're talking about the world of selfies with apps where you can just make yourself look a lot better, without having to. I mean, it came home to me. I was working in Korea 2 years ago. And because I'm a portrait photographer and I take great pride in my portraits. And I took a portrait of this female composer and I sent her the 5 selects, and then I saw her again. I said, did you like the portrait? And she went, nah, not really. I mean, but don't worry, I fixed them. And I went, what do you mean? She said, on my iPhone, I've got an app and they look good now. And I went, wow, no one's ever fixed one of my portraits before. So get real, So, within all of that, given that now there's this terrific flexibility of ease of using, let's say, something called a camera and something called an editing device. And it's no longer the domain of, like clever filmmakers, who, it was made clear to me when I started making films that this was a business that I had no right to assume that I could be a member of it because it was full of geniuses. And it was up to me to find out because nobody would tell me. That's gone from that to being everybody's potentially is a filmmaker now, and within that, if someone has a really creative idea, there's nothing stopping them from doing a kind of brilliant piece of work, which could be 5 minutes long or 23 minutes long. Or the other thing that going back to what I said before about we go back into cinema now is like, why the hell are we still having to watch something that's 95 minutes long? I was brought up with the idea as a performance artist that 60 minutes was about the limit for your bum to sit comfortably in one position, before you kind of started wriggling a bit, unless the film was so brilliant that you forgot about it. And that, a good experience for an audience was probably about 55 minutes, enough time to have some substance, but at the same time, you could then, you could leave. And of course, the idea of the length of a feature film is entirely based on cinema owners' idea of maximizing their profit, whilst giving the audience something that they felt they were getting their money's worth for whatever they were charging them. So, I like the fact that right now, all these balls are up in the air and, we're not quite sure how they're going to fall, and actually, for once, the audience will be the people who are voting in terms of like, either they like it or they don't like it in that respect, which of course is very dangerous too, but, because they're also being led by unscrupulous capitalists who just want their money.
So since you said that you forget about yourself when you watch a film, maybe from there we can talk about your film suspension of disbelief, and also the formats of narration and the structure of narration, and how it kind of like this structure started changing in terms of like digital filmmaking and experimental cinema.
Yeah, well, in the suspension of disbelief, I really wanted just to explore with an audience as a kind of, like a dinner party conversation almost, these various questions about, what is a story, what is the suspension of disbelief? I talked about Jung's idea of, participation mystique, which was more interesting to me. And this idea, which I love, because cinema has become so universally assimilated into all cultures, unlike, let's say, high art or the esoteric novel or something like that. Cinema is the one thing that everybody has experienced and everybody knows pretty much how it's done. So everybody knows now. There are no illusions, no tricks, So people, ordinary cinema goers will talk about special effects and like, oh, that wasn't very good. This guy wasn't very good. I was like, they know everything, So the idea that there's, this is now an open secret, how you make a film. So the ability to do something that moves the audience, despite the fact they know it's a trick, it's really, it's an interesting challenge now because of the openness of the information. So I wanted to start exploring that. And then I started becoming fascinated in a way by the fact that, and something that's discussed in Time Code in a humorous way by the young filmmaker at the end, is like, why are we still editing in that way? And why are we still, using these same tropes, And why haven't we explored format more? So, for example, in Hotel, some scenes are widescreen, some scenes are four screens, some are two. sometimes the screen is tiny in the middle and the rest of the screen is black. And I thought, oh, this is so interesting, because the identification of format is such an important part of understanding the genre of the story that you're watching, you know. So these are all, in a sense, within what seems to be the limited body of cinema in terms of, you know, how you express yourself. Actually, no, there are lots and lots of possibilities that have totally been unexplored, you know. I mean, here's an interesting thing. I have become fascinated by the use of subtitles, you know. So you realize that someone says something in a foreign language, and then the film is going to appear in, I don't know, the American or the British version or the French version. So somebody is employed to translate. And that's such a key thing. Mm-hmm. You know, how good is the translation in terms of the sense of the film? And then there is the possibility of also playing with the translation poetically in terms of, you know, it's not exactly what they said, but if you're smart enough and you understand the language well enough, there isn't an equivalent in English for this, say the Turkish version of this, but here is an approximation. It's not a literal translation, but it's a poetic approximation. And I thought, wow, there is so much possibility with subtitle, even if you're using subtitle in an English film and using English subtitles, that in other words, the subtitles can become a literary comment. And the more I started to think about subtitles, and then I use Premiere Pro as a kind of editing tool. I'm sure most people do now, you know, either that or, you know, Final Cut. Mm-hmm. And, you know, so I started, I was working in Korea and very interested in making films in a foreign language that I didn't understand. So I've worked a lot with a Japanese actress and text in Japanese, which I then translate afterwards, you know. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. When you're editing a film, you have no idea what someone's saying, but you get the sense from the physical acting and so on. So when you start to using the subtitles, you think, wow, what a great possibility. So on Premiere Pro, up until the latest version, the subtitling app was pretty awful. It caused the computer to crash. It was very volatile, etc. But it was kind of interesting in the sense that you could choose a text and everything, but you could also put fades on the subtitle. And the idea that, let's say someone says, I love you, or I'm going to kill him, or whatever, something very volatile, mm-hmm. and there's a long pause. Do you want it just to go doing, or do you want it to go slowly fade out with a piece of music, say? So you're dealing, the brain is dealing with the idea of text as well as the huge seduction of visual information, which is overwhelming. But text, and the part of the brain that intellectually deals with language, is an incredibly evolved part of the brain organ. And so this idea of fading and being able to manipulate language in that way was such a wonderful idea. I've just upgraded to the latest version of Premiere Pro, and they've cleaned up subtitles, which is so sweet of them. So they're much more efficient, but they're really designed for Instagram now. And so you go on any app, any kind of video on YouTube, and they'll say, we've made this so much more useful for you guys, you know, for Instagram or YouTube or whatever. You can't do fades anymore, because who would want to use a fade, you know? So they just got rid of that. So you think, wow, all this amazing technology that you're supposed to be able to do anything you want with, and actually suddenly you can't. And that was a really important thing to me. So I'm actually researching now to kind of find an alternative kind of thing that I can buy that just does better subtitles or whatever. But as an example of the kind of narrowing down to the middle of the road of all the things that they think are desirable for filmmakers to have, which end up being just for YouTube or just for Instagram Live or whatever, you know. So that's kind of sad, the way the industries have actually just, like with anything, like all our culture, have decided to kind of middle road everything, you know. And the effect of algorithms on the product that Netflix is now putting out, you know, is appalling, is catastrophic, you know. And if you work on the basis of supply and demand, young filmmakers are going to be told pretty much a combination of that and a kind of woke culture where it's not possible to say anything about anybody anymore. even in the context of an artistic statement, you have to be so careful. You put all those factors together, the end result is going to be like the most bland piece of porridge, with no sharp edges at all. And that worries me a great deal. So the equipment's really good for the most part. What you can do with the equipment is worrying, and becoming more so every single day. I mean, I'll give another example. I was working in Korea. A friend of mine is an American who speaks Korean, got a great part in a new series, which is set in, I think, the late 14th century on the border between Korea and China. So it's a kind of vampire type, epic K-drama. And they were filming for 7 months or something, and they put out the first 2 episodes. They had 2 episodes still to shoot. And within a week, I don't know if you know what a netizen is. A netizen is a citizen of the internet and they have strong voices.
Mm-hmm.
There was such a massive list of complaints about the fact that the costumes were too Chinese inspired. And in one scene, they seemed to be eating, with Korean food, also some Chinese food. The $28 million production was put into the dustbin. They cancelled it. It's not been screened, and they cancelled the last 2 episodes simply for that reason, because there is a real kind of antipathy in Korea to the fact that the Chinese have taken over quite a few of the media companies, and they think an undue influence on Korean, South Korean culture. So elements like that, that's like they worry me a great deal, more so than, let's say, whether it's digital or film or whatever.
So maybe from here we can talk about the viewing experience of the audience, especially during and after the pandemic, since most of the theaters are closed. And maybe we can talk, because you mentioned about like people are watching films on their phone. So maybe we can talk about like, should we like make our films for the theater screen, or should we is it like a difference then? Like, should we make our films for the phones? So how this viewing experience changed, especially through and post-pandemic period?
Yeah, I think there's a confusion on the basis that it's a this or it's a that. I mean, clearly, we cannot turn the clock back, and the phone is here to stay, and I, along with everybody else, derive great pleasure from watching little clips and, things that people sent me, and, all kinds of things on the phone. And I struggle a little bit with the phone. The iPad I find quite satisfying for watching even films on and things like that. The sound is not bad. And so in terms of, let's say, the ease of watching something, it's quite good, so let's say TV things. And I could say sometimes movies as well. I watch it on that. I have a huge TV screen, like everybody, like a big widescreen film experience. And I can't remember the last time I watched that. It's quite interesting. And it's got on the, like a sort of special sound system with a subwoofer, which I disconnected because the mixes now on films for television are so bass heavy that dialogue becomes harder and harder to actually listen to. So I become very bored with the way films are mixed. So I don't watch my big TV anymore. So I watch on an iPad or on my phone a little bit stuff. I've always promoted the idea that one of the great things about digital innovation is projectors and speakers. So we sort of say, you buy a couple of, let's say, I call it Bose speakers, or it doesn't really matter. A couple of small powerful speakers, and a mid-range now digital projector. Quality is kind of amazing. Enough to fill a screen big enough that you could get, say, 30, 40, 50 people comfortably watching that film. Now, to me, that would be a good experience, you know, like almost like film clubs. The idea that I personally go less and less, or went less and less to the cinema, because I found it an upsetting experience in terms of I couldn't stand the smell. I couldn't stand the idea that I was surrounded by people eating very sugar-based products, very noisily, checking their phones, and then having to go to the toilet regularly because they'd drunk 3 gallons of Coca-Cola or whatever, and basically just talking and stuff like that. So I found I would get really, really angry, and it would destroy my experience to the extent that I would sometimes choose not to go, even if there was a good film that I really wanted to see, unless it was a special, like an Everyman Cinema, or sadly the ArcLight that's just closed in Los Angeles, you know, where you pay a bit more money because you know people are going to be there because they're cinephiles, you know. But the cinema experience for me hasn't worked for a long, long time. Like I say, the idea of a kind of bespoke pop-up cinema is so possible now, technically speaking, and would be, for me, perfectly satisfying. I mean, I agree with like Walter Murch and all kinds of people who just say, cinema sound, for me, the best is that the speaker is directly underneath the screen. So when people are talking, it's coming from the person you're looking at, and then a couple of discrete speakers on the side to give you some music. I never was a big fan of surround sound and all that. I mean, I'm sure for Star Wars and children's films, I'm sure it's fine. But for grown-up films, I think it's quite enough to have, you know, a central speaker and some stereo around it. That's a piece of cake to create. And I'm really surprised why, you know, it's not happening more and more and more. Because on the one hand, you could screen classic movies quite easily. Secondly, you could screen your own films and in front of a kind of critically but invited audience or paying audience or whatever. So the idea that cinema could now be liberated from cinema chains, to me is incredibly appealing. And so going back to Hazel, what you said, my preference would be to make films for that kind of environment, in the same way that as a musician, I'd rather play for 100 people than 10,000, as if I've ever could play for 10,000. But you know, 100 people is pretty good. 50 people is pretty good. And going back to my theatre performance art days, 50 people, 100 people, that's a great audience, you know. Anything bigger than that, you definitely lose contact with the majority of the audience, you know, and you have to then project, going back to things like Glenn Gould, you know, it's why he gave up performing for that reason. So the idea of salon, you know, cinema, to me is the way forward. And then the iPhone, fine for everything else.
I think we have a question from the audience about this, like viewing something on the phone. They say like David Lynch apparently said something 10 years ago that watching a film on your phone is not exactly watching a film. I didn't know that. I just learned it from our audience. So what do you think about that? Do you remember that him saying something like that? And why do you think he said something like that? Because I know that David Lynch also transformed to video with Inland Empire, and he was like starting from that, he always used video, and he was a really innovative people about digital.
I interviewed David Lynch at Camera Image in Poland at the same time as I interviewed all these DPs about the future of digital. And it was a very funny story because I interviewed David and I'd just seen Inland Empire. And at one point in the interview, which was very funny, I said, would you ever go back to film? And he goes, I would rather die than go back to 35 millimeter. I would rather die like this, you know. And he said, I love them, and I love my cinematography and everything, but it's so slow, and the lighting. He said, you just with my PD-150, I said, you change a light bulb, you keep running for 45 minutes, you don't stop, you don't go cut, you know. And so he was totally, of course, like me, in love with the idea that, you know, the restraints had gone. You didn't need a crew there. You didn't need 30 people who didn't give a damn about your film standing around wondering what time lunch was, etc., etc. You know, you could be an artist. So on the one hand, David, you know, was Mr. Liberation and was a happy camper. Yes, of course, his comment when you're looking at it on phone, you're watching your phone. It's not a film experience. A film experience, going back to what I said before, is sitting with a bunch of people who, like with music, are picking up on the same vibe from the film. They may have a different opinion, but you can at a certain point sense that just by a response here and there, oh, and that becomes a collective thing, and then suddenly the film has a life. You know, it's a living thing. So this, unfortunately, the iPhone, you know, despite its incredible convenience, you know, is the lonely future of, you know, just us sitting, checking our Instagram, you know, and doing selfies, and you know. And they just did a survey saying that I think 80% of everyone surveyed said that it was the most indispensable thing in their life now. And it, you know, it stayed, and I'm sure it does stave off loneliness and so on. And my prediction is that to a large extent, you know, it will replace the necessity for relationships on the basis of a relationship being something that staves off loneliness, or you know, gives you the sense that you're not alone. Because I think the brain, and I talked about this in Suspension of Disbelief, the brain, whilst intellectually differentiating between reality and fake reality, it also accepts the same sensual input of data and will be satisfied with, you know, the input of the you know, the fake stuff. So, you know, it's a very interesting conundrum, and something, again, I don't think we can turn back. I think more and more people, and pandemic will have, of course, amplified this, or if you like, road tested it to such an extent where, you know, our dependence on the phone, you know, has been made tangibly clear now. So that experience I call the phone experience. I'm with David Lynch when I say the cinema, let's call it, if we say cinema, actually what we mean is more than one person watching the same image and having a collective response, you know.
Mm-hmm. Maybe from here we can talk about these experiencing films through multiple screens, because like during pandemic, actually it started before pandemic, there were this like desktop films, like they were like Unfriended, and then last year we saw Host, which was like shot through Zoom. It was shot during pandemic, I think. So what do you think about these like looking, because I think those films are meant to be shown on laptop, since it is a laptop screen that we're watching. So what do you think about this structure of cinema, like this structure of films?
I think it's kind of boring, actually, because I mean, there was a whole debate after Timecode came out. You know, then Russian Ark came out, and then the German film, which was kind of sweet, that came out a couple of years ago. You know, about the kind of all in one take, and so there was a lot of debate, certainly in the British press, about
Victoria.
Single take cinema. Yeah, and I kind of thought they totally missed the point. You know, the whole point about Timecode was not the fact that it was, you know, 4 screens, and people kept saying to me, "Wow, pandemic, digital, Micah, you should be in your element now." It was really much more of a, from an intellectual point of view, much more an exploration of how narrative can be developed without edit. You know, so the idea that, you know, that you could look at 4 streams, and then you could do all kinds of interesting aesthetic things visually, but then also in terms of narrative. And I will say to students, you know, treat it more like a piece of music, like a string quartet, rather than the old convention of cut, 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 cut. So when, you know, the pandemic inspired all these kind of Zoom type, you know, narratives, I felt, okay, that's just, in a way, that's so obvious because that's what everybody's looking at. So all they're doing is putting a sort of drama smell onto it, which of course is possible. But it doesn't seem to me intellectually to be pushing the boundaries of multi-streaming, multi-image kind of creativity, because there's something far more interesting potentially in using more than one image at the same time, to do with engaging the brain to be much more alert and less seduced, if you like, by a single screen. So, I mean, I often ponder about doing extending that experiment, but of course it would take time and money, and I'm doing other things, and so many other people are now working in that medium, but I think not in a particularly interesting way. Of course, it's good that, because human beings are incredibly resourceful. So like what we're really good at is solving problems. So if you say, you can't do this anymore, damn sure someone will prove you wrong quite quickly. So I think, it's admirable that, theatre started broadcasting, their performances. Not very good, I don't think, because they didn't. It's quite interesting. So like the National Theatre now, films, it's Shakespeare play, and they shoot it on 4K or 8K or whatever, and then they bung it out, and you pay your money, and you're supposed to have a theatrical experience. To me, you missed the point entirely. What's really interesting about filming a play would be shooting from the wings, seeing the actors prepare to go on, checking the audience out, so the cameras could move around, and you could still, let's say, at the core of this, you could still have the Shakespeare, but it would be 10 times more interesting if you could actually, because we all know it's bullshit. We know there's an audience. We know it's a set. We know these aren't really, these are actors pretending to be people. So, again, going back to, bless him, to David Lynch in Inland Empire, the way he's always been interested in, this wall, breaking the wall of reality, unreality, fake reality, and so on. And then going back to what I said before, because the audience is so familiar with the mechanics of theatre and drama and film, why not be exploring more of that, as it were? Because, it's okay to see the back of the set sometimes, and so on. But that's me. That remains to me incredibly interesting, and not just in an experimental way for me and a few people who read intellectual magazines or anything. I genuinely think the audience is interested in that too. When you talk about putting on those special glasses and the headphones and all of that, and having these fake reality experiences, of course they are interested.
Maybe like from here, when you talked about like breaking the structure, breaking the wall of the narration, etc. Maybe we can talk about the 36 dramatic situations that you written on it, and how it kind of like plays with the narration, mostly maybe the mainstream cinema, the industry, because you said like everything is like quite the same, the structures, like the stories and etc. And audience doesn't want to see that. They want to like see the backstage of it, the background of it. Maybe we can talk on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, part of being bored with the structure of mainstream films, and entirely based on the idea that producers and productions and studios, are run by very scared people who are terrified of doing anything original. So they always just look at statistics and kind of go, "We want this film to be more like that." We think the ending is too dark. We want it to, we want the audience to be happy. God, why? And et cetera, et cetera. But basically based on fear, the idea that, that a film needs to have all these kind of surefire things in it to make it a sort of financial success. So at some point when I was having a clear out, discovered this original, the 36 Dramatic Situations, the French version, written in the 1890s. And I started reading it. I thought, wow, it's really interesting. It's very out of date. It's really interesting. So I talked to my publisher and I said, let's do an updated cinema version of the 36 Dramatic Situations, because I checked it out and I thought it's pretty accurate. I imagined like 10 or 15, 20 different movies. I checked it for, it seems to tick all these boxes. It's using these situations, quite good, So with a bit of updating. So I started writing it and I ended up creating a pack of cards almost by accident, because I had 36 postcards. And then I went, wow, I've always been a big fan of chance and like using the I Ching or tarot or whatever. I wonder what it'd be like if you just use chance, to write a story. So I created a pack of cards. Where are we there? And there are 36 of them, I drew them all and, and then self-published them. So to go with the book. And so there, one day I tried. So I shuffled the cards and then I invited someone, I did it myself too, to take, where's the camera? 3 cards. So I'm going to take 3 cards to show you sort of what I mean. I'm just randomly taking 3 cards. There's one, there's one, and there's one. I mean, working on the boring basis of the 3-act structure, why not, So I've got 3 cards here, and I'll show you what they are.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite interesting. So I discovered that most dramatic situations, they all seem to come from Greek drama, the Bible, and that central to all drama is the idea of family and the destruction or the reunification of family. So we've got 3 cards here. Revenge contained within a family, which could be incest and so something within a family, well, Hamlet, revenge, that's perfect. Then my favorite card, which is purely, and I added this one just for cinema, because the minute cinema came along, we became fascinated by dream state, and the subconscious, so we have dream state. Am I dreaming? Is this really happening? Dreams are often seen as premonitions. Different truths might be revealed through a dream. In Western culture, the therapist has replaced the witch doctor, and there's my illustration. So dream state was a great card because it allows you, in a Lynchian sense, the idea that you don't have to be realistic. You could be dreamlike in part of your narrative, right? And then the final card, which is, hugely important, is the recovery of a lost one. A family divided by disaster tries to reconnect. A child tries to find missing parents. A search for a person who will otherwise die, a ticking clock, and so on. So the recovery of a lost one. And of course, the cards, a bit like the I Ching, are totally ambiguous. You can call it literally family, or you can call it metaphorically a family, or whatever. But then the idea was then, okay, sequence these 3 cards into 1, 2, and 3, and then start writing a story. And the interesting thing about this system is that normally when I start writing, I immediately fall back onto my rather limited life and my memory and my childhood. And as Bunwell says, if you were fortunate to have 2 or 3 traumatic events in your childhood, you're sorted, because you can rework those for the rest of your career. If you've had rather a dull, rather nice middle-class life, it's really tricky to write a good story, So, but the idea, and then I remember a comment years ago talking about bipolar disorder and artistic achievement, and it said, however, one of the greatest storytellers in the world was not bipolar, was not manic depressive. His name was William Shakespeare. He just was a really good storyteller. He didn't think he was Hamlet or Macbeth. He just invented this stuff. So the idea that you could just take the cards and that's it, just invent a story, just get on with it. And then you will start to impose your own DNA onto that story, inevitably, of course, because you're the writer. So I found that very, very helpful for me when I was writing, and then subsequently I've used it a lot with students and also with songwriters and all kinds of people who find it kind of refreshing as a way of waking up the brain, stimulating ideas, and then starting almost from one card and then start telling a story. So that's one attempt I've made to shake up the idea of what is narrative, what is a story, also in time code, the fact that if you are trying to tell a story in 4 parallel streams, it throws you into a completely different mindset from fade up to, cut to, 3 weeks later, cut, fade, there's very useful, those devices of editing. I mean, they're very useful, but they're very tired now. They're very boring. And when we see them over and over and over again, the audience must feel a sense of deja vu, like literally, surely I've seen this film 4 million times, because it's very hard within that limited technique to be super inventive. I mean, things like jump cuts, that was a big deal when they first started happening, or but everybody knows what a jump, it's no big deal now. So, I think part of your responsibility as a filmmaker is to reinvent the wheel regularly, as with any form. Look at painting.
Yes. One of our audience asked a question about the sci-fi genre, and saying like, is sci-fi genre dead? Because now the sci-fi genre is almost all about Marvel or DC comics adaptations. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the saddest things that's happened to our culture is that cinema has been taken over by children or people with childish mentalities who, I mean, what the fuck is all that about? I mean, why, Marvel comics. I mean, I enjoyed them when I was a teenager, and there's some great artists who were illustrating them, particularly Jim Steranko. But I mean, really, I don't go and see any of them. I have no interest in any of them. But on the other hand, the two things I always say to potential filmmakers or anybody who wants to listen is that any great film should be a combination of two things. It should be a black comedy, and it should be sci-fi. Let's take Hamlet, for example. To me, a very funny sci-fi, in the sense that we're on the planet Denmark, and magic realism occurs regularly, or sci-fi. I mean, right now we are living in the age of sci-fi. So, like, I have recently bought this, which is it's a iWatch, I think it's called, whatever it's called, from which I can see people on it. It tells me if I'm going to die, apparently, if my heart is about to stop, or, I mean, it's a kind of amazing piece of technology. It really is. So, you just walk in the street and everybody's got sci-fi equipment. So sci-fi, in a sense, has become redundant as a genre, in the sense of you can't really get time travel, all of that. It's all been done. And it's being done now live through Zoom and all the rest of it. So, however, every film should have a kind of surrealistic varnish of sci-fi, I believe, because the fact that cinema always has been sci-fi. What's interesting is when you don't push it too far, but you're pushing it enough for it to be weird, different, surreal, but in a way, not ridiculously surreal, just enough for it to be like an experience that's lifting us out of our normality. So I think it's a great time for subtle sci-fi right now. I mean, one of the great sci-fi films is Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and it's just a kind of normal film. It's almost like a Thornton Wilder play with a sci-fi overpaint, And I always thought that those kind of experiences in cinema are just very powerful. So I think it's a great time for sci-fi. It just needs a little bit, needs to go for a bit of a style makeover, I think, so it's not so obvious anymore. And certainly, let's move on from Marvel.
Yes, yes. We have another question about the technology that we're using right now, and like, because we talked about like everyone a filmmaker right now, and one of our audiences asking especially about videography and cinematography, since we have like gimbals now, everyone is using a gimbal with their hands and shooting some like continuous long takes and like really like this like moving images, like, and like this really dynamic editings, mostly for Instagram. So what do you think about these like gimbal videography and this like dynamic editing?
I think, you know, as long as they're happy and they don't injure anybody while they're doing it, you know, then I think that they should just carry on gimbaling happily, gimbaling and gambling. Cinematography has gone through a disastrous period where at a certain point, there's a famous saying, you know, it's rather vulgar, why does a dog lick its balls? And the answer is, of course, because it can. And I think feel the same way about videography and cinematography in general. It's like, why don't people watch Hitchcock movies just to sort of to understand and learn when to move the camera? But for the most part, why are you moving? Because the camera is a kind of a character. It's subjective, it's objective, it's all these things. Why are you moving the camera? I always say to DPs, why are you moving? You know, now everybody has this little slider, you know, so they just for a little bit of movement. I said, well, why? Why is that character, this person watching the scene, sliding sideways or sliding forwards? You know, the one tool that I really love about digital cinema right now is in post-production is the digital zoom, because it is so perfectly still and you can control it down to 0.001 of the speed and so on. It's fantastic. Whereas I always hated tracking shots and, you know, I didn't mind, you know, controlled zooms as with a Bergman movie or whatever, but you know, I've always been depressed by camera movement, and now the gimbal, yeah. But again, it's like going back to the dog story. I mean, I see people so happy with their camera equipment, young, mainly guys, you know, they've got a gimbal, they've got this, and I did a shoot a couple of years ago of a music performance that was very beautiful. But I was actually running the sound, and they brought in a couple of young guys from the film school who had all their Canons and their this and their gimbals. And then I had to edit the footage. There was this piece where the pianist was playing this really beautiful improvisation. And I was looking, I was going, hang on, what's going on? And basically, the guy had got this new bit of kit, and he basically very slowly did a 360-degree turn of the camera, very slow and controlled, until it finally came back to horizontal again. And I actually wrote to him and just, you know, very violently, and sort of said, you know, what on earth were you thinking when you did that shot? I mean, why? Mind-boggling. Why did you do that? And the answer, of course, like the dog, is he did it because he'd bought the kit and he wanted to try it out with no thought of what he was shooting or anything. So, yeah, I'm appalled by the lack of aesthetic understanding of what a camera is with the new technology. I'm appalled. You know, I mean, the fact that it autofocus and that, you know, auto exposure and all of that. So in one sense, it looks pro, but from an aesthetic movement point of view, it looks like the worst amateur stuff I've ever seen. And that includes feature films too, I have to say.
So from here,
on the other hand, just to be positive.
Sorry, please keep going.
Just, you know, the gimbal is useful if you're stuck in one position and you don't want to get wobbly. You know, the gimbal is very useful, like Steadicam is, if you just keep still, and then you can move when you need to move. You know, but it's teaching the fact about camera movement is such a vital thing. And I wonder if anyone's teaching, because I think the problem is the camera world is controlled by camera geeks who are just in love with the 4K or the 8K of it and this and that of it. You know, they just love the technology. It's such a boy thing. I mean, maybe if there were a lot more female DPs, maybe there would be a shift in the aesthetic, which would be interesting, because it is very male centric, the camera world. I mean, interesting debate. If anyone's got anything to say about that.
Yes, because like in our department, for example, we see that, you know, all these like tech guys, they're like guys mostly talking about the cameras, and women are mostly like talking about the sense of the cinematography, mostly like the framing and etc. But guys are all about, like, you know, mostly about the technical issues of the camera, or like the quality of the image, like it is 4K, what is that, or like look at my gimbal, etc., something like that. So yeah, I think like gimbal is like the new steady, maybe we can say.
Yeah, I mean, but it does, you know, because my hope also was, you know, around about 2000, because cameras were suddenly very, very light, that the whole argument about it takes a man, a big fat man, to carry this stuff and to hold it, you know, because it wasn't. They were very heavy, and you know, undeniably, men are, for the most part, taller, stronger, physically stronger than most women, you know. So the great leveler was, well, if the camera's light, then that no longer has got anything to do with anything. That you no longer functionally need a man to hold the camera, right? But very quickly they made the cameras heavier again, so that we didn't get rid of the trucks and the dollies and all the rest of it. It still maintains this, you know, this male stranglehold on the technology. And I do believe that, same with film crews, still kind of predominantly male. To me, the best is a good mix, like almost like 50-50. So it doesn't get too this or too that, but just so there is a kind of a good gender mix, you know, and that I think would affect the aesthetic. I mean, I really struggle sometimes with the, you know, lighting and camera department, because they're so butch, you know, and you might want to be doing something that's not butch, you know. So, and you can see them like somehow offended, not exactly offended, but uncomfortable with the delicacy of what you're trying to do, you know. So it's an interesting thing. I mean, you know, why hasn't that changed more rapidly, I wonder, you know? Well, the answer, of course, is capitalism and technology. It's about money.
Yes. One of our students is asking about the relation between your music career and cinema, because like she is also interested in like music as well, and she's asking like how like is it possible to do both, have a music career and a career as a director, like a composer and a director, how it affects your filmmaking. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit, because I know that you are actually coming from experimental music and experimental theater, and then shifted into cinema.
Yeah. I mean, because I studied music, both formal and experimental. And you know, in fact, you can't see my studio, but I'm doing a recording tomorrow with an experimental quartet, you know, that I played with pretty much all my life. So I already had that way before I started making films. So, and of course, economically speaking, I was a bargain, because I was a writer, director, composer. So I saved a lot of money. I'm not being sentimental here. That was just the reality. It was like I was cheap. So I got away with a lot of it initially, you know, just because I could do all of it. And because ultimately I'm a filmmaker, I'm not going to be precious about the music or the script or even what I shot. By the time I get to be the editor, I can be brutal with myself. And it's just a lot easier than being brutal with a nice person who's written a score that doesn't work, or, a writer that's hanging on to every single word, et cetera, et cetera. So I've always just found it very, very useful. And to the extent that when I have taught at the National Film School and things like that, I always suggest, look, I think you should make it compulsory for all directors to do the following: to do some acting, to do some music, just do a couple of weeks of at least to understand what a minor chord is, or a diminished chord, or, basic sort of, nuts and bolts of, how you make music, just so you understand the terminology, but also do some acting just so you understand the dynamics of performance in front of a camera. So when you're going to work with actors, that'll help you, and so on. That should be part of your education. So, for me, it's just been super useful to have all of those things, and it's just very convenient, But I tell you something interesting is that of late, as part of the kind of like re-examination of what is cinema and how are we using music. So I think music is now probably the most abused element in the world of documentaries and mainstream filmmaking. Like, scores are just awful, I'm really hating a lot of the music I'm listening to, because it's so manipulative and repetitive, and it's either just like Philip Glass, or it's like this, or it's the same tropes are being just worked to death. So I started actually using the iPad. There's a great Moog synthesizer app on the iPad. It's really cheap. It's like 30 quid or something, but and it's phenomenal. So I've been making pure electronic music for some short films that I've been making, and I'm really loving the effect because it has no sentimentality whatsoever. And then occasionally, you throw in something that clearly is sentimental, but use it in an ironic way, combined with some electronica, and it kind of like changes the color. So again, to your student he was both a filmmaker and a composer or musician, I think there's great things to be done now with sound. Let's call it pure sound, or call it score or sub-score or whatever. But time to really kind of like that film, It Follows, that sci-fi movie that came out a couple of years ago, that had such a good score, and that was kind of electronic score, and I think it was two guys who did the score. That really impressed me more than a lot of other films I've seen, actually.
Mm-hmm. We have another question about your director experience on the TV show The Affair, and the question is like, you directed, I think, one episode in Affair. So how was your experience? What do you think about directing a series with many other directors?
It was not a good experience, I have to be honest. And it's a shame because, I did an episode of The Sopranos, and that was a great experience because I was one director of many. But, the quality of the show was pretty good. I mean, undisputedly. And you were in groundbreaking television at the time, And I was a fan. I actually offered myself up, as a super fan. And they graciously said, I will come and direct an episode. So that was interesting. Tricky, but interesting. Because of all the things of, I was in season 5. It's already pre-established. It's already pre-lit. It's, they have their system. And you basically just have to work with the actors, which I enjoy. So you're there to direct the actors, fundamentally. On The Affair, and I enjoyed the first 2 seasons of that, there's a thing called season 5 syndrome, which is when none of the actors really want to be there anymore. They start, and even on The Sopranos, where they start to feel resentment that they're being somehow kept back from a brilliant movie career by being prisoner of this multi-episoded, series, and I always sort of say maybe around about season 3 or season 4, you should always have horrific natural disaster and just wipe everybody out, and then maybe replace them if you want to keep the series going, but have pity on the actors because they really become very unhappy after season 4, always, unless they're making so much money like on Friends that they're ecstatically happy for the rest of their life. And they also seem to be having fun. So, but we have this phenomenon called the showrunner. So the showrunner is like the god of TV now. And the showrunner on The Affair was, I don't know what to say. She didn't seem very interested in any input. The actors had zero interest in being directed. They were just unhappy. And at a certain point, I put on my dark glasses, having offered up a scene and then being rudely interrupted by an actress who said, "I'm not going to do that. Here's what I'm going to do." I just put on my dark glasses. The first assistant said, "Is there anything I can get you, Mike?" And I went, "Yeah, you get me a ticket to London, because I just don't understand why I'm here. Why would you want me to come and direct when you don't want to be directed and you don't want any input? I'm a writer." And the script was not good, and they delude themselves in these writers' rooms that they're sort of somehow doing groundbreaking stuff. It's just another story, and they're desperately trying to kind of like make the plot work and still be believable after 5 seasons. That's a challenge. So not at all a happy experience, but a very interesting one, in the sense of like just seeing the kind of mental fatigue that settles into these epic TV productions that are just about money. And the shelf life of a story is not that long. I'd say, Sopranos just about managed to pull it off, but they were close to their limit. The Wire, they did it well, but you look at something like Breaking Bad, and that just turned into a ridiculous Marvel comic by the last couple of seasons. Just bonkers, just at a certain point, like, you have to respect your audience. They bought into this idea, and now you're just going to sell them down the creek, So I have real problems with these miniseries that just go on for too long.
Mm-hmm. We're almost at the end of our time, so maybe we can sum it up with one last question, which is like, since you have experience in both mainstream film industry and experimental cinema, what would you recommend to emerging independent filmmakers? Because people mostly tend to think that it is either one or the other, either the industry or I'm going to go with more experimental film.
While I'm doing this, I'm just going to shift slightly, because I just got a notice saying 5% of battery left. I hate to die in the middle of an answer, but 1 second. While I technologically adjust to the challenge. Okay, so the answer to that is very simple, which is, if you make a terrific movie that's experimental, it would be a economic success. There are many examples of this, and your best weapon is innovation. You need a good story, but you could tell it in the most outrageous, experimental way, to the delight of your audience, who would be like so grateful that you're giving them some new food, But at the same time, the core of all of this, the whole conversation is story, is narrative. The truth of the matter is this: the only reason people go to the cinema is for stories. And these stories have to be about that somehow they can relate to, as in, I see myself there, but for the grace of God go I. When I was doing, the dramatic situations, I kept looking, kind of going, I see that. I see myself potentially in that story, And that what makes an audience engage is when they meet a character, could be a bad character, but somehow a sympathetic bad character, kind of go, I know why he's doing that. I could see myself making that same mistake. Because that's what drama is. A drama is a kind of open psychological dialogue about us and our fascination with ourselves. That's what it is. The quote at the beginning of the book from Bergman is, cinema is the ongoing exploration of the human face, meaning that's what the camera does. But psychologically, what it's doing is it's exploring. We're looking at a mirror. I mean, bless them, Instagram and all the rest of it and selfies. That's sort of, they think that's what they're doing, but they're not. They just actually, that's just called narcissism. That's not psychological exploration. That's just a mirror. So, number one, get an interesting story. Number two, tell that story in the most outrageously interesting way you can think of, and do not be scared to piss people off, because also film needs to inspire conversation, debate, make people angry, make them happy, make them talk. It's a debate. So a good film is not just an entertainment. It should be entertaining, but it should also be something that kind of really makes us happy to talk. When you come out of the film, like, what was that? What did you think? And blah, 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 So, don't narrow yourself down into the commercial versus the experimental. Experimental films are fundamentally boring. Commercial films are fundamentally boring. Occasionally, an experimental film or a commercial film somehow hits a button and is interestingly shot or something like that. So don't limit yourself to these categories of I'm either an artist or a business person. That's bullshit. It's like, if you don't believe me, just look at a list of all the really interesting people you think are really good filmmakers, and then look at the films and work out, well, when did that film come out and what was the competition that year and why did that film succeed? Do a Tarantino and actually just do your own research. It's actually, it's all pretty self-evident, I think. So do not limit yourself in that way.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions? Aras Hocam or maybe Andreas might have.
Well, I mean, if you have time, I have a question actually. At the beginning, you said when you were talking about your conversation with Soderbergh, you said you predicted that there will be 20 times more good films, yet there will be 20 times more bad films too, which points to an exponential growth in film production. And I presume some of this exponential growth is due to streaming media platforms, which take over both TV watching and cinema going on their own, form. What do you think the impacts of these streaming media platforms on creative filmmaking? Because they also it's a different delivery method than cinema and television, and it kind of brings the fragmentation of the audience. Do you think these platforms creates potential for creative filmmakers? How does it affect the creative filmmaking scene in general, you think?
No, I don't. I think there's two problems. One is because it's going out, in a fragmented way. Not, for example, despite all the things that were wrong with cinema distribution, the audience did vote with its feet very, very, so a film comes out, word of mouth very, very quickly turns itself into audience figures or not. So there was that kind of effect. And then you could create a hit, in the sense by word of mouth because everybody was congregating to see the film in a certain way. When it's going out to individuals, it's much more difficult to quantify whether good, bad, or indifferent, because these giants of distribution, Netflix, Amazon, Apple, and so on, the amounts of money that we're suddenly talking about that are being hurled at product and then dispensed of almost immediately, as in, done, next. And their growth in terms of membership is how they measure their financial worth, etc., means that the way of quantifying what is a film, and is it a good film or whatever, and is it something that's worth aspiring to, in terms of because pretty soon we're going to have no choice. That is going to be the one marketplace that we need to go to, So it's very, very confusing, and it's not, from a quality point of view, I don't think it's particularly helpful, because again, the algorithmic assessment of product, that's what it is, product, has had a dire effect. Just in the short period of times I've been watching Netflix, it's become so anodyne, middle of the road, and safe, and that's purely based on their analysis of product, and so what they're greenlighting. And they've got so much money, you'd think they would, but then they also want the kudos of an award-winning film. So amazing. So 10 nominations for the David Fincher film this year, and it wasn't even streaming in the top 50 or 60 on Netflix. The same, I think, with Roma, 2 years earlier, or the divorce movie that came. So there's all this kind of fuss made about these award-winning films up there, kind of thing, but no one's actually watching them actually on Netflix. They're not being pushed because it's not that kind of a market. So it's really, really confusing. So it's just a kind of collection center for everything, like garbage and everything else. And how can you use this in an interesting way? At the same time, like I said, we're pretty soon going to have no choice but to go there, because there isn't going to be anywhere else, unless you follow my example and sort of say, like, pop-up cinemas, small distributions, keep the cost of your film down. We didn't talk about this, but there's no reason to have a big budget anymore. Keep your costs down, and then make a little bit of money, enough money to pay for your next film from small distribution. The problem with cinema right now is everybody thinks they're going to do world domination. They think they're going to get millions. And that's the way it was. When I was working in Hollywood, there's a lot of money to be made. And you could earn huge amounts of money as a director or a producer or whatever. That's all changed now. So I think we need to kind of reassess the financial world that we think we're entering into. So if you want to go into cinema to get rich, then it's very clear. You have to make a very boring commercial kind of product that's basically aimed at children or slightly retarded adults. If you want to make a more interesting film, then like an artist, like a painter or writer, then set your sights a lot lower and then do it. But smaller budgets, more kind of indie kind of distribution approach, etc., etc. If it's a hit, then Netflix will buy it from you anyway. Because they'll like the dinosaur's tale, it'll get through to them that this is an interesting film. That's a different approach.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Yes, if you don't have any questions, I think we can finish it here.
It was wonderful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
We are really happy that you joined us.
Well, let's do it again.
Maybe after the pandemic, you can visit our university at one point.
Yeah, we will. Well, thanks so much.
Have a lovely weekend, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.